Okay, well, when Brian asked me to do this, he hadn't warned me that indeed, all of these people are going to be presenting all these different perspectives. So I had to try and find a novel way of presenting academic contributions, because in Alberta, as most of you know, all of the contributions are intricately tied together. Lifeways of Canada started in the basement of the Earth Sciences building, was affiliated with the Department of Archaeology. Most of the people started in that area, and I was certainly one of them. I've been a faculty member, but do I know all of the academic contributions? Hell no. But I'm going to sort of try and give you a perspective that is somewhat different. And 40 years ago, actually, I'm starting a lot earlier than that, simply because a lot of our theoretical perspectives have their roots way back in the very, very beginnings of the exploration of the plains. So essentially, the plains were seen as an extension of the Great American Desert, and the Palliser Triangle was part of that, and people saw this as a place that was uninhabitable by human populations, primarily because Europeans just went through it. It was a zone of passage for them. They had no intention whatsoever of establishing. It was unfit for agricultural production, so it was a zone of passage, and they assumed that all indigenous people were unable to sort of inhabit that particular location. That idea is still with us. Look at the hypsothermal. Anytime there's climate change involved, we leave the plains. We head out, we go out. And that continues to this very day with the Prairie Regional Adaptation Collaborative, where people are doing research and saying, if global climate change happens, what's going to happen? Everybody's going to leave the plains. And so those notions have been part of our perspective, okay? Then we follow that up with the first anthropological studies. And there again, we have people sort of looking at the plains culture, the traditional plains culture, and seeing it once again as the product, not of people living on the plains, but actually of people moving onto the plains from the peripheries, and bringing with them a whole constellation of traits that you can see right there. And that development of the typical plains culture is sort of associated with subsequent ideas that, at the time of contact, when they introduced the horse and the gun, all of a sudden there was progress. And people were moving left, right, and center, and no indigenous populations were actually resident in the area that they were found by Europeans at a later time. And we see that same idea being used in archaeology. We have replacements of cultures. We have influences coming from the east. And we have, for example, the Shoshone presence on the plains. We then move to culture history, which is the brainchild, as you know, of Franz Boas, who was sort of critiquing cultural evolutionists and trying to sort of say, listen, there are different ways of looking at this, and one of the important ones is that cultures develop from their antecedents, from the preceding cultures, and so that we should be looking at individual cultures and their changes through time, rather than looking at this globally or, with the large perspective. And one of the important contributions of plains archaeological research was William Duncan Strong's notion of the direct historical approach, where people looked at modern indigenous cultures and extended their history back in time by looking at the archaeological record for evidence of their antecedents or their precedents. Unfortunately, we also have this conflicting notion of people moving and across that landscape and replacing, having cultural replacements. And Dick Forbes, who started archaeology in the province in many ways, sort of felt that, although he initially started working with Blackfoot elders and sort of looked at archaeological sites as being representative of their culture, he and Tom Kehoe subsequently changed their perspective and started looking at it from the direct ethnological approach, that was Kehoe's proposal, and the direct inferential approach, which was Dick Forbes's. And in that way, you had to establish the continuity between the archaeology and the historic tribes rather than using the direct historical approach. Culture history, as you know, remains with us to this very day, and it was originally set up primarily to deal with chronology. So we use stratigraphy and seriation to actually establish those local culture histories that people were talking about. And on the plains, stratified bison kills were absolutely perfect to give us that kind of culture history. And Old Woman's Buffalo Jump, Head Smashed In, Gull Lake, all of these contributed significantly to establishing that particular chronology. And the chronology was based on changes in projectile point styles. And we see that in terms of the broad sequence for Alberta, but we also see it at a local level. And point typologies, as you folks all know, still are important in terms of plains archaeology. What I find interesting is, though we have modern technologies that give us radiocarbon dates and everything else like that, if there is a conflict between the date and the point always wins, which is kind of interesting. And we are continuing to refine these point typologies, trying to narrow the ranges of the intervals that different point types are still prevalent. The new archaeology is about the time that this association started, and it introduced a whole series of new approaches to doing archaeology. And it was a scientific approach which required very rigorous methods. And we were going to come up initially with universal laws of human behavior. That fell by the wayside. And eventually, what we ended up focusing on was ecology. And ecology was sort of one of those areas that was developing at exactly that time. And one of the most prevalent ideas that was used, especially among hunter-gatherers, was the notion of settlement patterns and settlement systems. Okay? Settlement patterns is simply the distribution of sites on the landscape. Settlement systems is looking at the relationships between those sites. Okay? And of those, what we saw here is that the seasonal availability of resources was key in terms of looking at hunter-gatherers. The argument simply being that we moved across the landscape to collect resources in a particular fashion, and the annual subsistence round was key in that. To do that rigorously, we had to sort of develop a whole new methodology. What you must remember is that when Dick Forbes excavated Old Woman's Buffalo Jump, the bones were part of the matrix. They were tossed out because the points were what was interesting. If you're going to talk about the annual subsistence round, now you need much more information. And this brought on researchers from other disciplines, environmental reconstruction. So we had to bring on board people who were familiar with climate, topography, landscape changes, plant communities, past, present, and future. All different types of data were being used, animal communities, and for us in particular, environmental change and bison ecology and bison behavior became sort of the focus of that research. We were particularly interested in seeing how bison behavior influenced human adaptations on the plains, particularly the settlement patterns. We also had to adopt new methods of finding sites. You couldn't just go and look where you expected to find sites. We had to come up with a very objective way of assessing exactly where the sites were across the landscape. And I remember coming back to Calgary for a Chocmoo conference and sitting down with Barney, and we had a bottle of wine, and he said, "What the hell is this bullshit with these quadrats and everything else like that? You guys, give us some culture history." And I was trying to explain to him that the reason we were doing that is because what industry wanted was the density of sites. They didn't care what the sites represented. They wanted to know how many sites they had to deal with. This was the way to actually do that, okay? The point here is simply that all of this was implemented so that we could objectively come up with information to support the arguments, the hypotheses that we were testing, okay? And in that, you had to come up with, you dealt with sampling fractions, but the most important contributions have to do with shovel testing and deep testing. And those are with us to this very day. When you're doing a transect, you're following a pipeline, or you're following a highway right-of-way, you're doing transect surveys, and when you are looking at a subdivision, you're doing the regional study. Data recovery also became important. All of a sudden, all this other stuff that had been thrown away in the past as we were doing cultural history became important. So we had to change our methods. We had to sort of set up grids with neat information about all of the relationships of materials. We had to collect not only the diagnostic artifacts, but everything else. Screening, water screening became important. This is Al Bryan's excavation in the 1970s. He got into trouble for that, mind you, but he was trying to implement a new strategy, and they kicked him out of the park for that because he was damaging the stream. But the point here was simply that it was important to collect not only the diagnostic artifacts, but it was important to collect everything, faunal materials and the like. And we also used profiles. The pedogenic units, or the buried soils, were important. Sediment samples were collected. Monoliths were brought back. In fact, there are some stored that people don't even know where they came from. And we still have them, but unfortunately, context has been lost. Faunal analysis became very important. Bison in particular. So we were sort of looking at, and I remember in the 70s, as I was doing my undergraduate work, a course dedicated to faunal analysis, and that course continues to this very day. All right? And so what's important here is that if you're going to talk about bison migrations, you have to be able to look at the evidence and see whether or not bison were present in that area. There was identification. We needed comparative collections. I spent a lot of time cooking bison bones and bird bones, and we stunk up the Earth Sciences building, and they kicked us. They said, wait a minute, you got to find another place to do this cooking because it is destroying our appetite. So that was a problem. And then there were also, all different methods that had to be devised to sort of come up and establish firmly that the animals were being hunted at this time of year, they were being killed, they were butchered in this way, and everything like that. I remember going to a Chocmool conference, listening to, George Frizen describe mussels by name and saying, here were you had to cut to get the one off, and that, and so forth and so on. So we took a very strong interest in that. Lithic analysis, again, the science of lithics. So looking at the physics of actual rock, how you break a rock and get a flake and everything like that. My favorite is our stainless steel Indian here. That's Robson Bonnickson's design, and it was specifically set up so that he could figure out the angle and force required to remove a flake. And that's the kind of analysis that was being done. Out of that came lithic reduction sequences. There were a number of theses dealing with experimental design and use of tools, looking at useware, seeing how these tools changed as a result of them being used, looking at shooting arrows at a bison carcass to see if the arrow would penetrate or if it would break. All of these were considered to be important aspects of actually establishing that connection between behavior and the archaeological evidence, what ended up being called middle range theory. Ceramic analysis sort of started slow on the plains. Dale knows that. I know that. It still hasn't gotten anywhere. No, sorry. But some early work by Alice Kehoe in terms of looking at the assemblages. There were very few at that time. Jimmy Griffin did some interesting work for Dick Forbes based on the collections that he had found. Bill Burns' ceramic typology is probably the first detailed study of ceramic assemblages on the plains. And today we have David Marr, we have Dale Waldy, and we have a number of other people who are working on ceramic assemblages and giving us a lot of information. And their work started at this stage as well. Site formation processes also ended up being important, and these were also investigated and explored by archaeologists here. So we had, I'm sure all of you are familiar with Schiffer's, or at least those of you who have taken the course in theory from me should know about Schiffer's CNN transforms. That's absolutely critical. So the point here is simply that C transforms were considered important. And one of the classic studies that I had to read, that many of you who were here, Robson-Bonington's Millie's Camp was one of those studies, and Bob James's work among the Willie Creek Dene, all of these established some very important lines of evidence connecting behavior to the material remains. We also had people working on N transform. These are chemical and mechanical weathering was considered to be important. We also looked at the differential preservation of different materials and the like. So experimental research was being done at that time. From processual archaeology, we moved to post-processual archaeology, and I put Alice Kehoe there, because she's larger than life. Everybody knows that. And she certainly is someone who sort of has been pushing that agenda. And in that, we see a shift away from science to a more humanistic approach to archaeology. And we saw that as well in terms of archaeology on the plains. So feminist archaeology was an entire issue of plains dedicated to the identification of women in the archaeological record. Indigenous archaeology as well. At the same time, there were trends that have continued on. So Jack Brink was still working on more detailed analysis of FAUNAL material in terms of their nutritional value. Trevor Peck was doing incremental growth line studies, and others. Stable isotope, Neil McKinnon was doing work in that area. So we had a number of specialized analyses continuing on. Microdebitage was very important at this time, and the early occupation of Alberta again saw a shift as geologists sort of reassessed their interpretations of the late Pleistocene, early Holocene, and geographic information systems came online, but initially archaeologists on the plains as elsewhere were simply using it to sort of identify environmental parameters that might help them explain where archaeological sites would be located. And geoarchaeology, site visibility, Mike Wilson's work was very important. Ethnicity sort of became one of the humanistic ways of looking at the archaeological assemblage. So we had Koyman's butchering study, we had Barb Cooley's study of faunal remains, and a number of other studies such as Greaves' work on projectile points and Dale's work on pottery. I'll let him talk some more about that. Rock art also became one of these things that was looked at in terms of ethnicity. Household archaeology also appeared on the plain. It sort of was the landmark sort of study in the early 80s, the shift from settlements to individual households. And on the plains, in particular the area that I'm most familiar with, teepees are the big thing. And so we spent a great deal of time during the 80s and 90s looking at teepees. There were a number of workshops on how we document that information, the information the rings can tell us about the time of the year that the structure was set up, and everything else along those lines. And season of occupation, number of occupants, how many hides, how much energy would be expended to get all of that. Indigenous archaeology, once again, Barney sort of showed the way in terms of Pintapi's, the initial incorporation of indigenous communities in archaeological work in the province. And that has continued on with ethnobotanical works by Sandy Peacock and Evelyn Siegfried, collaboration and consultation with indigenous people also. I was involved, but many others in both the private sector as well as the academic sector were now recognizing the importance of including indigenous people in archaeology. We also, in the new millennium, starting in 2000, suddenly there's a shift of an emphasis toward plant remains. And I think Brian Corman, more than anybody, has sort of been promoting the importance of looking at botanical remains from archaeological sites, anything from wood fragments to seeds to phytoliths and starch grains. Now, I don't want to belittle Alwyn's work in that area. The point I'm making here is simply that right now it seems like starch grains and phytoliths are the answer to a whole bunch of new questions, right? So we have to look at that and sort of recognize that that is sort of an important contribution. Residue on tools also fit into that. We have novel approaches with GIS. So GIS initially was just used to sort of relate environmental parameters to site locations. Now we have people who are incorporating cultural criteria, Lindsay, Matt Morris. There are others who have sort of done that. This here is work by Kirsten Anderson, or Falzerano now, who actually corrected the distribution of materials. So the upper slide there shows you the slumping of cultural deposits, and the lower one shows you how you can correct those and then look at the distribution of materials. And it's also possible to add screen materials to look at the spatial distribution of archaeological remains at sites. I've been spending a lot of time looking at or trying to understand the archaeological record in terms of alternate worldviews, primarily the worldview of the Blackfoot people, and I see that in terms of artifacts. So for them, it's not the piercing qualities of the point, it's the raw material from which that point is made, and the color of that raw material is more important. You can look at teepee rings, looking at structure and symbolism inside as represented in the design of the teepee, but you can also see that reflected in the archaeological record. And then movement across the landscape. My argument is simply that they weren't following buffalo, they were doing it for totally different reasons. They were historical, they were social, they were ritual, but not necessarily bison. Future prospects, matrix. We're going to explore new worlds. And in terms of theory, one of the key ones is niche construction theory. What that means is simply that we all know that with the global climate change debate today, that people are influencing the environment. Archaeologists, evolutionary ecologists are now looking back at the record and saying, we've been doing that since we first moved on this planet. And humans, other organisms create the niche that is best suited for them. So they're not adapted because they adapted to the environment. No, they created the environment that was best suited for them. That's what niche construction theory. Hyperreality, it's sort of like, if I can construct a world in the past, then which world is the real world? And so there's a theory now about the fact that reality is sort of difficult to define. And so now you have to develop theories to help you understand that. And then grounded theory is equally important in that area. Data recovery is going to change. We're going to start focusing more on remote sensing, ways of analyzing archaeological sites, archaeological deposits, without necessarily having to excavate them. Avoidance, I think, is going to be important, and we're going to use a lot of methods of remote sensing to sort of get at these. And we're then going to be recovering small samples and use detailed laboratory analysis. Those phytoliths and those other things are going to be sort of key. This is just my personal perspective, folks, on where we're going. I may be completely wrong. Analytical methods, we're going to focus more on the recovery of microscopic materials and detailed analysis of microscopic materials. Ancient DNA of plants, of animals, of bacteria. I just read a proposal by researchers, archaeologists, who are trying to look at the spread of malaria by looking at the ancient DNA of malaria. Stable isotopes, trace elements are going to be important. Soil chemistry, soilscapes. So you're going to be able to reconstruct the activities on the landscape simply by taking soil samples and performing detailed analyses. And then we've got this wonderful portable XRF instrument, which is going to give us all the answers about lithic raw materials, ceramics. We just have to point that gun, shoot, there's the answer. We have it, we can sort of build a story after that. We can create our reality just by sort of taking a whole series of shots and creating a reality. And then, to make it even more appealing, we're going to sort of present that to you in a virtual world. So your computer-generated landscapes, computer-generated artifacts, landscapes, homes, everything. And sort of, you'll be able to walk around in your home with your little iPhone and be visiting Stonehenge and looking at it in excruciating detail. Virtual tours of archaeological sites. We're even going to develop computer games. So you're going to be able to sit at home and play a game that's based on archaeological data. Can you imagine? And then the whole idea behind this is that we are democratizing access to tangible and intangible heritage. So essentially, we are making it available to everybody. And they're all going to have their own stories about what this all means. What are the challenges? Well, for us as academics, it is training. How are we going to train people to do a good lithic analysis, but also do ancient DNA? Right? What kind of technical expertise are these departments of the future going to require to be able to keep up with all of these technological advances? Funding. You can get money, CFI money, to build a brand new DNA lab. Can you get money to fund somebody, to pay somebody to run that lab? No. Can you get money to get the supplies to run that lab? No. So the point here is that we have problems and technical expertise. Can you get somebody, a technical person, who can deal with lithic material and an ancient DNA lab, a sophisticated virtual computer lab? One person to do all of that? I don't think so. Are they going to give us money for 2 people? Hell no. So we're in trouble there. We're going to have intentional and unintentional constructions of all sorts of different worlds. Ergo, the hyper-reality, right? I mean, it's sort of like, we're going to create them, we're going to sell them, and people are going to buy them based on how good they look, not on what they are based on, okay? And we're going to have challenges in terms of trying to evaluate these competing interpretations of these very different virtual worlds. And with that, I say thank you.